Hello everybody, welcome back to another lecture. This is our third last one, so we're getting near the end of the course. Hopefully the nice weather isn't being too distracting and making it particularly hard to study and see the course out, but I guess we'll just see what happens. At least there's not too much left if you've had quite enough of the meaning of life by now, and if not, well, good for you. I'm glad to hear that. So today we're going to take a look at John Kekes. So we've got Keeks, Wolf, and then next week, just on Monday, Nielsen and Wisdom left. So Keeks is a 20th century American philosopher. He's still active in New York State. Writes mainly on ethics, political philosophy, questions of value, and he's a conservative thinker who has objected to egalitarian and liberal theories for various sorts of reasons. They don't factor in, I don't think, particularly much into this piece, but it's just, it's in terms of a little bit of a background about him. So what are we going to see out of Keeks? So this is actually a piece from 2000, I believe. So we're going to see a handful of things coming out of them. I've got a fair number of slides today. I'll try to keep things as succinct as possible. This video might turn out to be a little bit of a long one, but I'll try to keep it as to the point as possible. So Keeks discusses and rejects both religious and moral approaches to the meaning of life. So we're going to hear what those are. We're going to hear some familiar points, so I'm not going to belabor them. What he says about the moral approach is a little bit novel and interesting, so we'll hear what he has to say here. Now, he also explicitly discusses Taylor's piece that we were just looking at earlier this week. Wait, yesterday. That was yesterday. Okay. So he talks about Taylor's piece and rejects that, an entirely subjective view of the meaning of life. We're going to hear why. He gives us some interesting distinctions to keep in mind. So maybe I should even throw this on here because that's really this kind of side point. Ultimately, he advocates a pluralistic approach. Life, which, well, that doesn't read correctly. Hold on. I am going to take 2 seconds and fix that. Okay, back. Oh, it's a little embarrassing, but you know what? I think we can all live with the fact that I am an imperfect being who occasionally makes mistakes. So now this fourth point, now that it actually reads correctly, he advocates a pluralistic approach to the meaning of life, which uses objective conditions and can be fulfilled in a number of ways. He also has a subjective component. We'll see when we get there. Okay, so this question of meaning, what is it to lead a meaningful life? Keeks spends a little bit of time here to start talking about it. He does think it's a good question because, of course, one view we can take is that it's not really a good question to ask at all. We're going to see at least some version or versions of that on Monday when we're talking about Nielsen and Wisdom. There's going to be basically on Monday just a little bit of a discussion about whether or not this was a good question at all. Maybe that shouldn't wait until we've looked at a whole bunch of different answers to the question or different approaches to the topic. But I think there's some sense in doing it that way. So Keeks thinks this is a good question. As he puts it, it is demeaning to participate in all manner of activities, expending great effort without asking why we should do all this. So he says, often as we're going through our life, we aren't asking this question of, oh, what's the point of it all, or what's the meaning of life, as we're going through things. But he says it doesn't mean it's in fact a bad question. It's one that can be asked, and really it's this question about, or at least it seems like, or it can be this question about the overall worthwhileness of things or their point and purpose. So he thinks it is a good issue to concern ourselves with, even if it seems a little abstract and so on. He talks about John Stuart Mill's autobiography a little bit, and he says this serves as a nice example. So rather than invoking Sisyphus, Keeks invokes John Stuart Mill, 19th century English philosopher, political reformer, businessman, he was a member of parliament for a while, worked on ethics, classic statement of liberalism, logic. Very, very important, influential thinker. So if you've done more philosophy, good odds you've run across Mill, or you've already run across him. And in his autobiography, Mill is talking about He's really committed himself to the cause of social reform, making the world a better place for most of the people in it. That's really what he was motivated by. And that motivation really kept him up, and it provided a real meaning for his life and made the things he was doing seem worthwhile. But then eventually, at one point, he really sort of asked himself, like, what if the world were just made a better place? You just snap your fingers and you accomplished all your goals. Would you be happy? Would you be satisfied? And he said, well, no, I wouldn't be, in fact. And so he sort of fell into a little bit of a depression, kind of a despair, where he then felt detached from his own products. And this is exactly what Keeks wanted to distinguish. Mill still thought the projects he were engaged with were good ones. Morally speaking, they were worth doing. It's not that Mill came to doubt whether or not reforming society was a good thing. Instead, Mill felt a kind of detachment from what he was doing. He lost his usual kind of motivation. I don't know about you, but I've certainly had similar sorts of experiences, maybe not huge sort of lasting depression, but I'm often motivated in what I'm doing. I enjoy what I do. I think there's value in it. And every now and then, maybe not. Right? You just kind of get into a bit of a funk, and it's just not clear why we're doing what we're doing. And Keeks thinks this is a good example of where this question of meaning comes in, rather than, say, trying to invoke the cosmic perspective or the absurdity of human life or something like that. We can think about Nagel and Camus and so on. Keeks thinks we can focus on a lot smaller scale than that. As he puts it, the experience we need to understand is the break that sometimes occurs in everyday life between us and our projects. It must also be allowed that people may find their lives meaningless because they are meaningless. But not all lives are. The question is, what is it that engages our will and emotions, gives meaning to our lives, given that our projects are not effective and we do not suffer from a sense of absurdity? So Keeks wants to put right in here, lives can be meaningless, right? So it's not that all lives are guaranteed meaning or that no lives have them. Instead, lives may or may not be meaningful. And he says, given our projects aren't effective, so we can have bad projects. So there's going to be, a certain dimension here, a certain evaluative dimension to whether or not our projects are worth doing in some sense. And Keeks thinks suffering from a sense of absurdity, that there's really no point in doing anything, that all human life and all human activity is really pointless and fruitless and ridiculous in some sense. That itself is going to be a stumbling block to seeing lives as being meaningful. So he says there's really two traditional answers to this question of meaning, the religious and the moral answers. So Keeks looks at both of these. He rejects both of them. We're going to see why. But he thinks from examining these two usual approaches or usual answers to the question, we get a lot of really useful information. And in fact, ultimately what he does in the piece is he goes through a number of approaches to the meaning of life that he thinks doesn't work. And as a result of the analysis about why they don't work, he really draws out a series of conditions he thinks need to be met for lives to be meaningful. And that's what he gives us at the end of the piece. And he basically gives us a checklist, right? So Keeks gives us the set of conditions where you sort of go through, and for a given life, if you can say, yep, that meets condition 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, then you've got a meaningful life on your hands. But if you go through the list, you say, oh, you didn't get condition 2, then you're going to be wrong. So we'll see what this is when we come to it. So he thinks the religious and moral answers fail. He also thinks Taylor's purely subjective answer fails. So let's see why. So this religious view. So this Keeks tells us some things here that we've heard. He says, okay, I don't want to focus on any sort of the particular details of any one view. He says, there's this sort of common religious approach that involves seeing some kind of cosmic order in reality. And he says this is, common from really in various religions. He names Buddhism, Christianity, Islam. I'm fairly certain he mentions Judaism as well. He says we get a similar kind of picture. It differs in the details, but really it says that there's this cosmic order to reality, and that human life gets meaning by having the right sort of connection to that cosmic order, right? And of course, the details here differ about whether it's covenantal existence or mimicking the life of Christ or whatever it might be. right? Seeking nirvana, or trying to build up good karma, or whatever. He says, okay, so he gives us the familiar reasons. So this is what I'm not going to belabor because we've heard this before. So stick it out there, right? He says, look, there's really no evidence in favor of the general religious approach. So it's not like he says, oh yeah, Christianity gets it wrong, but Judaism's pretty close. Right? He says, no, like just across the board, there's really no evidence in favor of these religious views. And in fact, the way he frames it is that the religious view is, or religious answer, is really tied up with supernatural structures and some kind of supernatural reality. And he says, precisely because that's what it's supposed to be talking about, nothing within the natural world, nothing that we can observe, or nothing that would really count as evidence for us, does really count as evidence in favor of this supernatural order of things. And so almost by definition, the religious view or the religious answer is trying to invoke things that have to be believed as a matter of faith. So, so in some ways, maybe that almost empties out what he's saying into a sort of a priori truth. It's just analytically true that there's no evidence in favor of the religious answer, if in fact nothing that could count as evidence would count as being part of the religious answer. Let's bracket that. You could pick up on that if you want and sort of make an argument about that. It would be interesting. But Keeks says, look, there's really no evidence in favor of this general answer, this general view. Even if there is some kind of cosmic order, we don't know what it is. So he says there's no evidence in favor of the view that there is a cosmic order. Even if there is one, right, we don't know what it really is, even if we did know about it, right? So counterfactually, right? Even if there were a cosmic order, and even if we knew about it, it would only give our lives meaning if it seemed good. And so here he differs a little bit from some of the other people we've seen, at least to some degree, I think, because he says if we take a look at the natural world, and if we're trying to make any kind of inference about this cosmic order based on what we see around us, he says, well, we see all sorts of morally problematic things all the time, right? People die from disease and accidents, and there are just mean and evil people. There are also good people. There are also people who are just kind of neutral. He says, so, if we have this cosmic order, it really doesn't seem like it's particularly good overall. And whatever's going to give our lives meaning really should be good, he thinks. At least if we're approaching things from a religious perspective. Keep this in mind, because when we get to his list at the end, ultimately he's going to say, life can be meaningful even if it's not particularly good or engaged in morally good projects. But he thinks, at least for the religious answer, whatever that cosmic order is would have to be good to give our lives meaning. And here we can think a little bit about Russell, right? Just imagine, again, just sort of counterfactually, right? Contrary to the facts. Wouldn't it be interesting, and what would be involved for believers in a religion that actually saw their deity or set of deities is actually being evil, right? So think about, something like, I guess you could try to cast it as a kind of Satanism. I think that's probably wrong given what modern day Satanists are like. But, imagine people who worship a being, right? And they say, right, we call the being God, or maybe some different name. And we think that being is all powerful and created the universe, but that being is bad, right? It's an evil being. It's created the universe to produce suffering. It's kind of like a Schopenhauer God, right? This was not Schopenhauer's view, but you can take Schopenhauer's worldview and sort of stick a creator God in there. And Schopenhauer would say, right, and if there's a creator God, it must be not very nice, because look at all the pain and suffering that's around. It would be interesting to have a widespread religion that said, yeah, our God is really just a jerk, right? Like really mean, likes to produce pain and suffering just for its own sake. But of course, we have to follow what this being wants out of us, because it'll inflict even more pain and suffering on us if we don't do it. Aligning yourself with some kind of cosmic order or divine plan produced by an evil being for evil purposes doesn't seem like the kind of thing that could give human lives meaning. This is really what Keeks is getting at, right? No, he is not saying God is evil or anything particularly like that, but he is saying, based on what we see around us, if there is some kind of cosmic order, it doesn't seem like it's particularly good. And so there's a problem in trying to derive meaning from that. So that's really there's a summary of what he says about the religious answer. So let's move on to the moral view, because this is where he's starting to give us something new and a little different from what we've heard. So he turns to the Euthyphro problem. So Euthyphro, that's a weird word. It's the title of a dialogue or short book, short work. It's like 10, 20 pages, something like that, by Plato. So this was written, what, 4th century BCE, when Plato was alive. And in it, Socrates talks to this character named Euthyphro, who's a priest, and they discuss really the nature of piety and what the gods love and its relationship to goodness and everything. And so there's this, what's commonly now called the Euthyphro problem, is really about the relationship between God and the good. And so Keeks poses it here. He says, assuming that there is a God, what is the relation between God and the good? Does God make the good good? That sounds weird, but does God make the good good? Or does God's will reflect the good that exists independently of it? The religious answer is the first. The moral answer is the second. So I'm just trying to clear this up a little. Basically, the moral view holds that the good, or what things are good, right? Goodness is something independent of God's will or preference. And this is an old, interesting sort of issue in religion and theology. At least the Western monotheistic religions have some version of this issue and their doctrines on this. So basically the idea is this. Look, let's just take like the 10 Commandments. You can take whatever you want, right? Any kind of moral advice or declaration from God. If we take the 10 Commandments, just say, right, let's just take murder. Is murder wrong, right, morally wrong? And God is just telling us that fact that, hey, by the way, murder is morally wrong. I know that, being omniscient and all-powerful, and I know everything. So just in case you had any worries about that, it in fact is wrong. Don't do that, right? It's evil. So is adultery. Or does God make those things wrong by declaring that they're wrong, right? That in fact God determines the moral value of certain acts and other sorts of things, right? So if God were different, right? If God were somehow configured differently or came to feel differently about certain things, could it be the case that at some point in the future God said, well, yeah, I still don't like murder, right? I don't like it. But adultery, I've changed my mind. That one's okay, right? Now adultery is fine. There's nothing wrong with adultery. In fact, it's a good thing, right? You might even be doing something wrong if you don't commit adultery, assuming you're married, right? This is what the issue is. Does God determine moral values in the sense of setting them based on preference or something like that? Or is the moral value of certain acts and just, sort of value in general, is that something that exists on its own and God is just fully aware of that, right? And this is what Keeks is saying. The religious answer is really the first one that he describes there, which is that the moral status of acts and things is determined by God. Right? God sets them, and on their own, things have no moral value. And we can see that, say, in William Lane Craig's piece. He seems to be saying something along those lines. Maybe not exactly, but I think it's awfully close. And then the moral answer is the second one. That things are really good and bad on their own, or right and wrong, and God is just telling us that, telling us about the status of those things. So, moving into this moral view then, because Keeks says, look, we really don't have good reasons, or to believe in the religious approach, so let's just bracket that and set it aside. So, sticking on the moral view, Keeks introduces a distinction between the narrow and wide senses of morality. The narrow sense of morality really deals with rules of conduct. As he puts it, the formulation of impersonal, impartial, disinterested rules that ought to govern human interactions. And so depending on the moral theory you have, this might be something like, only do what everybody can do without there being any kind of contradiction or problem, act in such a way to increase overall happiness, right? Or act in such a way to, you get a moral theory, act in such a way to increase the GDP or whatever, right? So there's this narrow sense, morality as really rules of action. I'm trying to figure out rules of action. There's also the wide sense, which deals with the right, which is what the narrow sense dealt with, right? What's right to do, what's wrong to do, but also deals with, as he puts it, the good. So, as Keeks says, in the wide sense, the concern of morality is not merely with what is right, but also with what is good. In this sense, morality is not only about rules, actions, and obligations, but also about ideals, virtues, conceptions of a good life, and so forth. So it's really the wide sense of morality that deals with the meaning of life. It's not just about rules of action and what's right or wrong to do, but instead, what's good in general, what's bad in general, right? What does a good life look like overall, rather than, should you lie to your friends if it's going to make them feel good, right? There would be something that the narrow sense of morality would deal with. The wide sense would deal with that, but within a broader domain of concerns. And Keeks says it's really in this broader domain that we get the meaning of life. The meaning of life isn't sort of a narrow question about rules of action. What should I do in this particular situation? Keeks says that's not what the meaning of life is. That's not the right kind of question. So now that we've got, in some sense, the cognitive terrain mapped, it's in this broad sense of morality that we're trying to think about the meaning of life. Keeks talks about Taylor's view. So, Richard Taylor's view that we were just talking about yesterday. So Keeks describes Taylor's view thusly that his view is that the agents thinking that their lives have meaning is the necessary and sufficient condition for their lives having meaning. Now, if you haven't done much logic or run into these necessary and sufficient condition, if you haven't run into those conditions before, just take a moment to explain them. So a necessary condition is a condition that must be met in order for something else to happen or be true, but alone does not guarantee that the something else will happen or be true. A sufficient condition is one that is enough to make something else happen or be true, but it's not necessary. It's not the only condition or the only way to make that something else happen or be true. So what does this mean? Just looking back to the quotation at the top, talking about Taylor's view. Taylor's view is that the agents thinking that their lives have meaning is the necessary and sufficient condition for their lives having meaning. So if we think just back to Taylor yesterday, really in Taylor's view, Sisyphus's life or anybody's life is meaningful if they are, really gripped and engaged in the projects they're engaging with. So it's really the agent themselves judging that their life is meaningful that is enough to make their lives meaningful, and that's the condition that must be met. So it's the one and only condition, right? If somebody says, yeah, my life is meaningful, I'm doing what I love, that's it. And it doesn't matter what that thing they love is, right? It could be rolling rocks up hills for no reason, like Sisyphus does. It could be, producing great art, trying to reform society, like John Stuart Mill, right? You name it. Doesn't matter. Counting the blades of grass on their front lawn, or whatever. So in Taylor's view, it's really just all about what the agent thinks themselves, right? That's it. Keeks thinks there's something wrong about this, right? So now that we've got the necessary sufficient condition, we're going to come back to this. So Keeks at the end gives this list of conditions that he says are all necessary. So he gives this whole checklist and he says you have to check all the boxes. They're all necessary. You have to check them all. And together, once you've checked all the boxes, they together are sufficient to make a life meaningful. Right? So Keeks is really giving you the meaning of life in a checklist, which might sound stupid, but in some ways that's what we're driving towards or striving for in some sense, that if we had a full answer to the question of what is the meaning of life, we certainly might, right, the actual answer might take the form of a checklist, or if we're trying to figure out what a good answer is, we are certainly going to have some set of conditions that must be met, or at least I think so, right? This is at least one way to go about thinking about these problems. I can recall at least at one talk I've given on the meaning of life, a colleague sort of looking at me and saying, you're putting this in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. That just doesn't seem like the right way to go about this kind of issue to me. And I kind of shrugged and said, well, what would be a better way, right? Just a big mess of stuff, right? Oh, I feel these things and those things, right? If we can distill it down to something like a checklist, that seems like we're getting clear about what the meaning is, or at least what we think is required for any kind of answer to this. kind of question. All right, so we've got the necessary sufficient distinction in our pocket here. So why does Keeks think the subjective view, like Taylor's view? He's really talking about Taylor's view here, but I think we could extend this over to Schlick's as well, given there are some differences between Schlick and Taylor, but I think, right, and here again, feel free to disagree with me if I'm wrong, I think there are very broad similarities between Schlick's and Taylor's position. So I think this would carry over to Schlick's as well, though maybe not. So Keeks gives us 3 reasons for rejecting the subjective view and accepting the objective view, as he puts it. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So just think about this as 3 reasons to reject Taylor's view, or a view like that that's purely subjective, that says whether or not a life is meaningful depends solely on the evaluation of the agent living it. First, if we are manipulated into pursuing a project and find out about the manipulation, we will no longer see the project as meaningful. This is not, when Keeks talk about Taylor, just think about Sisyphus being injected with that, whatever it is that makes him want to roll rocks. Once he realizes he's been injected, presumably he's not going to see rock rolling as meaningful. I think another great example of this, it's not Keeks, or at least I don't remember seeing him mention this at all. I just read the piece shortly ago, reread the piece. Being in a cult, right? If you are in a cult, however we want to define cult, but you've been somehow brainwashed or manipulated into pursuing the projects of the cult, right? Really, the cult is there and tells you, oh, your life is going to be better and blah, blah, blah. But really, it's all about just making the cult leader's life better, right? Making them get a sense of power and they can manipulate people and get things from them. If you find out about that, right, you sort of walk in on the cult leader laughing with friends about how stupid all his cult members are and how he's manipulated them into, being members of the cult and all this, then presumably you're going to cease to see being a member of the cult as something meaningful. Second, are merely having some desire is not enough to make the desire or the fulfilling of it meaningful. For instance, scratching your nose. The satisfaction of a desire is only meaningful if it fits in with the rest of our life in a certain kind of way, Keeks says. Right? So it's not just desire satisfaction or preference satisfaction that makes for a meaningful life. Those desires and their satisfaction have to sort of fit in with other things in a certain kind of way. So if I'm looking at my life and trying to judge whether or not it's meaningful, presumably it's going to have something to do with certain large-scale desires and preferences, being a great philosopher, or being at least a decent husband, or an acceptable son, or something like this. It's not going to be, man, I really want to make a good dinner tonight, and if I make a good dinner tonight, that's it. My life's just meaningful. Oh, my head's itchy all of a sudden. Oh, done. My life is now meaningful, no matter what I've done before or do in the future. That one time I scratched my head because I felt like it. That was it. All right, so this is really what Keeks is getting at. And third, the recognition that we want to pursue a project because we believe that it would make our lives better than other available alternatives. But whether this is true depends on whether its pursuit would actually make our lives better. So I realized, just as I was reading the first sentence, it came out a little funny. But what is Keeks getting at here? Really that when we try to pursue a project because we think it's going to make our lives better, we can be right or wrong about it. So look, just for instance, again, just sticking with myself because it's sort of nice and safe. I pursued becoming a philosopher because I thought it was going to make my life better. It would make me happy, and I'd be satisfied in a certain way. I'd get to indulge my intellectual curiosity and talk about cool, interesting subjects with interesting people like you. If that's why I pursued that project, there's a real question, and has that turned out, right? Did that work the way I wanted it to? There needs to be room there for the answer to be no. And of course, that's not to say the answer is always no, though for Schopenhauer, maybe it is. But it's really a question of making choices about our lives and recognizing that you can make the right or wrong choices depending on what the issue is. So Keeks says we are justified in concluding that in addition to the relevant wants and beliefs, those subjective conditions, there are objective conditions that must be met by meaningful lives. Consequently, meaning depends on both subjective and objective conditions, right? So really what he wants to do based on these 3 points here is reject the purely subjective view in favor of a view that's a bit of both, that has subjective and objective conditions. So just reading off another little point where Keeks is talking about this here, he says the objective view grants that the agent's attribution of meaning to their lives is necessary for their lives to have meaning. So just think back to Taylor here, right? But it denies that it is sufficient. According to the objective view, lives may lack meaning even if their agents think otherwise, for they may be mistaken. So in Taylor's view, right, the subjective, purely subjective view, the necessary and sufficient condition for a life to be meaningful is that the agent living the life judges it to be meaningful. That's it, right? There's no higher court of appeal. So if you talk to the brainwashed cult member, right, who is pursuing their life in the cult because they've been told, you know, if you do all this stuff and you make the cult leader's life better and you give us all your money and whatever, right? Like, spin it however you want. You know, the aliens are going to show up and they're going to give you a new body and a spaceship and you get to rule a different planet and whatever, right? A whole bunch of lies, right? That would violate some of the conditions being set out here, right? So for Taylor, you talk to that cult member, right? The one who is still brainwashed and manipulated. They totally believe what's going on, right? And you ask them, like, do you think your life is meaningful? Is this really what you want to be doing? They say, this is absolutely what I want to be doing, right? This, you know, there's nothing better, and my life's going to be so great once I get my spaceship, my planet, and, right? And Keeks, what Keeks is saying is that, look, for Taylor, he really makes no provision for the fact that, you know, those are lies, that the person's not going to get a spaceship, that the aliens aren't going to show up, right? That they've been manipulated into pursuing those projects. Taylor makes no exemption or counter caveat. There's no recognition of the fact that people can screw up and be wrong. This is exactly what Keeks is trying to introduce here. He's saying there are conditions other than just talking to the individual and asking what they themselves think about it. So a way of summing this up rather nicely is that we have these 2 other objective necessary conditions for someone's life to be meaningful, and they are that the wants we have must be genuine. They can't be the result of manipulation. They can't be surface level things like, oh, I really want to scratch my head, right? They have to be genuine desires, right? Or genuine wants. Second, the beliefs we have must be true. So if where we find meaning in our life is predicated upon false beliefs, like the aliens are going to show up and give me stuff, or, you know, by, right, you know, engaging in philosophy. I believe I'm going to be a world famous philosopher and I'm going to rule the world and everybody's going to pay attention to me and I'm going to solve all the deep mysteries of human life and everything. It's just not going to happen, right? But imagine I was that misguided and I was pursuing philosophy because I thought this was going to be the result, right? I'm just the smartest person ever and everybody's going to realize it when I tell them everything. Right? No, you know, I'm okay, I think. I hope, right? I'm curious what you have to say at the end of the course. I'm, you know, brightish. I work hard. I think I'm reasonably okay at this stuff. But, you know, am I going to, you know, change the world and sort of answer all the big questions? No. I think there are a lot of people out there smarter than me and probably people that work harder than me. You know, there's a long history of philosophy, well over 2,000 years of human philosophical activity. And we still have some of those enduring questions. And there's more, there's new questions and interesting problems that come about with the changing world we live in. So it's just absurd for me to think, oh yeah, I'll solve all the problems. But if that's, you know, I thought the meaning of my life lied in me doing philosophy because that was going to be the result, I'd definitely be violating the second condition. And if I was only doing philosophy because I was manipulated, you know, I was injected with some serum that turns you into a philosopher, whatever that is, right? Well, then my desire to do philosophy probably wouldn't be a genuine want for Keeks. So ultimately, right, sort of pulling this together here, Keeks thinks that when we look at it, when we analyze these things, we recognize that we need not only the subjective desire to do what it is we're doing, right, that engagement, you know, what Taylor's talking about. We also require certain objective conditions must be met in order for our lives to really be meaningful. Right? So Keeks puts it this way, he says, the subjective condition requires us to be in the appropriate psychological states of wanting and believing. The objective condition requires that our projects actually make our lives better. Meaning then depends on the coincidence of these two conditions, on our psychological states being successfully directed toward the appropriate objects. So ultimately we get this from this moral analysis of the meaning of life. So Keeks gives us sort of part of the final list. Right? He says, according to the moral approach, our lives have meaning if the following conditions are met. First, they're not worthless, pointless, misdirected, trivial, or futile. Right? And he spent a little bit of time earlier in the piece talking about how our projects and activities can be these things. So I'm not going to go into sort of the distinctions between all of them, but feel free to look at the text. We have not succumbed to the view that all human projects are absurd. Right? If we think all projects are absurd or just silly, not worth doing, and so on, then he thinks we can't have meaning in our life. Third, we have identified with projects that we genuinely want to pursue. We've been manipulated and so on. And fourth, our belief that successful engagement in our projects will make our lives good or better is true. Right? So conditions 3 and 4 here are really coming out of what we were just talking about. But that fourth condition, Keeks says, is ambiguous. So we've got these 4 conditions outlined so far when he's talking about the moral view and thinking about it, but then he wants to analyze that fourth condition because he says there's really 2 senses of good. There's a moral sense and a non-moral sense of good. Right? And so, I've got a cup of coffee here, and if I say, it's a good cup of coffee, I don't mean good in the sense of, morally good, it's acting correctly or anything like that, right? If I say, oh yeah, you're a good person, you, my dear listener, you're a good person, right? I probably mean something different than this is a good cup of coffee, using good in 2 different senses, right? Generally, when we talk about people being good, we mean in the moral sense, though of course we might mean good in some non-moral sense, let's just say, perhaps counterfactually, perhaps not, Carl is a good philosopher. That in and of itself doesn't necessarily have a moral connotation to it unless we think all good philosophers are therefore good people, which I would like to believe that's true, but I'm not sure if it is. So we've got these 2 senses of good, and they can come apart, right? A life can be morally good but not satisfying, can be satisfying but not morally good, right? It could be both, could be neither. So good in that non-moral sense is really that kind of satisfaction or engagement that he was talking about with Mill. So ultimately, Keeks thinks that the moral answer to the question of meaning or the moral approach to the meaning of life fails precisely because you can have a life that's not morally good but is satisfying and engaging and so on, grips the person in that right sort of way. And he says we probably don't want to say that kind of life is too meaningful, although we're going to see actually is going to allow that. But you can have a life that's morally good that's not engaging and satisfying this kind of way. Such as John Stuart Mill's life, which Mill came out of this depression and everything, but just assume somebody's life was like that. So pick somebody who is really morally good, whoever you want it to be, and then imagine that they themselves found no satisfaction or engagement in their life. Right? They sort of go through and be like, I know it's a morally good thing for me to keep, campaigning for a better world and so on, but I just don't care. I really just want to be, what rock star, or I want to sit on the beach and sip margaritas, or whatever. So Keeks gives 2 arguments really to support this conclusion that the moral answer fails. I got a little ahead of myself, but just sticking them up here. Morally good projects need not be satisfying, and it's just not the case that only morally good projects are satisfying. Right? So because the 2 senses of good can come apart, right, the moral and non-moral sense, it's entirely possible to have a meaningful life that's not dedicated to morally good projects. Right? It could be neutral, might even be bad, and it certainly can be the case that people can engage in morally good projects and just not find them satisfying, right? And maybe keep at them for some reason or another, but not find meaning in them in and of themselves. Right? And here you could think about somebody who perhaps in a kind of bad faith, somebody who's religious, sees, believes that God exists and has this plan and tells us to be morally good and help others and so on. And so engages in helping other people, not because they derive any satisfaction from it, right? They don't really care about other people, just psychologically. It's just not in their nature, right? When other people are pleased and helped by their actions, they just, yeah, whatever, I don't care. But they continue doing it because they believe God is eventually going to reward them, with eternal life or getting into heaven or whatever. Okay, so Keeks thinks the moral view is going to fail precisely because of these 2 points, right? But these come apart. So what's left? Well, there's Keeks's pluralistic approach. So because both the religious and moral approaches fail, he wants to give us something else. And he wants to diagnose just a little bit further, why is it that both of these other approaches fail? And it's because they seek a general answer to the question of what's the meaning of life. So he thinks the common mistake here, both in religious and moral approaches, and he thinks just general philosophical approaches through history as well, is precisely that they're looking for some kind of answer that's going to apply equally well to everybody. Now, Keeks, in his pluralistic approach, as he calls it, gives us this checklist that he does think applies to everybody. So in some sense, maybe it's a general answer, but he thinks there's an awful lot of different ways to check those boxes off. So it's not like there's some kind of formulaic, lead a good life or help people or try to get into heaven or do what God wants or, fill it in however you want. There's no particular concrete general answer that we can give instead. What we have is this sort of big list of conditions. So I vacillated on this a little bit. That is, I sort of swung on my mind about sticking them all up on the slides here or not. I've decided not to stick all of the 7 conditions up, but just as a way of summing it up here. So Keeks gives 7 conditions right near the end of the article. It's this list of 7 things. I'm going to read through them briefly, but I encourage you to go actually look at them. I haven't stuck them here on the slides. So each of the conditions are individually necessary. So you have to meet each of the conditions, each of the 7. And they're jointly sufficient. So when all 7 are met, then a life is meaningful. So what are these 7 conditions? Oh, sorry. So this is the last slide here. So what are these 7 conditions? Well, we've already heard some of them when he was talking about the moral answer. So we get really the same similar conditions to what the moral answer gave, plus some more. So first condition, and this, it's talking about lives, whether or not lives are meaningful. So whenever they pops up, so he always starts with they and their, it's talking about lives. So first condition, they are not dominated by worthless, pointless, misdirected, trivial, or futile activities. Right, so lives don't have those things. Second, they're not vitiated by the belief that all human projects are absurd. Vitiated, undermined, might be a synonym. That's probably not a great synonym, but there's another great word to look up. Vitiated, undermined, reduced in value. Yeah, I'll just stick with that. Right. Third, they involve the pursuit of projects with which the agents have genuinely identified. They thus exclude all forms of manipulation. Fourth, their agents' genuine identification with their projects is based on their true belief that successful engagement in them will make their lives better by providing the satisfactions they seek. They thus exclude all projects in which the agent's subjective identification is not correlated with objective conditions. 5, their objective conditions are located in the natural world, not outside of it. They thus exclude the religious answer. And this harkens back to his discussion of the religious answer. I mentioned this a little bit, but I didn't emphasize it too much. Keeks, in talking about the religious answer and the cosmic order of things, precisely draws this distinction between the natural world, the one that we can engage with, have experience of, and so on through our senses and our reasoning and everything. And then, of course, there's some sort of supernatural world, and religion is really concerned with that. right, with what is beyond the natural world. And so he thinks the religious answer isn't going to work, and he has this condition in here because he thinks you can't rely on any particular aspect of religion or the religious answer on its own to give life meaning, right? Which is not to say, right, that this set of conditions doesn't add up to the claim that people who hold religious beliefs can't lead meaningful lives. Keeks isn't concerned with that. Rather, what he's saying here is that it's not the religious answer on its own that's going to give life meaning. Right? 6, their agents, so the lives agents' subjective identifications are based on the pursuit of projects that yield either morally good or immoral or non-moral satisfactions. They thus exclude the moral answer. So in conditions 5 and 6, Keeks is saying, look, it's not the religious answer and it's not the moral answer, right? It's not going to be either of those, but there can be certain aspects of, say, a religious life or a morally good life that can contribute to meaning in life or a meaningful life, though they on their own are not going to be enough, right? And in fact, they're not even necessary. You can have a meaningful life even if you're a bad person, even if you're an atheist, etc. 7, so the 7th condition, the last condition, their agents' subjective identifications with their projects reflect individual differences. They thus exclude all general answers. So for Keeks, it has to be this pluralistic approach that allows for different ways of producing meaning in life. There can't be any one particular answer. It can't be the moral answer or the religious answer. It can't be caught up in any particular project or activity, right? It's not like, well, you know, if you want a meaningful life, you've got to be a philosopher. And I'm sorry, if you're not a philosopher, you're just out of luck. It's not going to be anything like that. Rather, it's, right, there are certain attitudinal components here, right? So you have to have certain sorts of attitudes and you can't have other sorts of attitudes, but you can't think that all human activities are absurd or worthless and so on. We have to genuinely identify with our projects, right? We have to do things that we find interesting and satisfying and fulfilling, which differ from individual to individual, right? And we can't be manipulated. We have to have generally true beliefs about what it is we're doing. So we have to have a kind of clear-eyed sense of what's going on. So, as Keeks puts it, he says, the pluralistic approach, his approach, recognizes that any project may contribute to making a life meaningful, provided it meets the conditions listed above. Meeting these conditions excludes many possibilities, but for the present purposes, the most important among them is the possibility of a general answer to the question of what project or what type of project would make all lives meaningful. So, what have we seen from Keeks? Sort of summing up in a little bit of a nutshell, Keeks really disagrees with Taylor and Schlick's, though he doesn't talk. I think actually he mentioned Schlick in one spot, but he's not really talking about Schlick's approach. Keeks rejects that purely subjective approach to the meaning of life. It's not just about the individual agent having the right feeling or judging what they're doing in the right sort of way and saying, yes, my life is meaningful. I'm really doing what I want to do and doing what I was put here to do, using Taylor's phrase. Right? It can't be that. Why? Precisely because there are some problems with that view, right? The agent could be manipulated. They could be wrong about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And Keeks thinks that would be a real problem, right? So given that the agent themselves, if they came to find out that their beliefs were false or that they're manipulated into believing or doing something, that they themselves would judge their lives to be meaningless or not have meaning, at least from those things anymore. He thinks that we need to extend that over to the set of conditions for a meaningful life. So Taylor's view is not quite right. Taylor's onto something, because in fact we need that engagement and that that right sort of relationship to what we're doing for our lives to have meaning. This is precisely why Keeks says that the moral answer fails, because the moral answer itself, right? Oh, do good things. That doesn't take into account our own engagement with what we're doing. So he says that the moral answer is going to fail because it doesn't appreciate the subjective component enough. And the religious answer is going to fail in part because it's so hard to judge whether or not our beliefs in that domain are true or not, right? And there's an interesting question just to sort of throw out there. You know, it might be one you want to pick up on and engage with or not. You know, what if, right? So let's at least imagine, right, for the sake of argument, you have a certain set of religious beliefs, whatever they are, right? Now, maybe you actually have certain religious beliefs, maybe you don't, right? Let's just assume you've got some certain set of religious beliefs, whatever they are exactly. And based on those, you think your life has some kind of meaning, or at least they can possibly contribute to your life's meaning. Now, imagine, right, counterfactually or not, just imagine, that in fact those beliefs are false, right? So if it's something like, well, if I do good works here on earth, then I'm going to get into heaven and be happy forever. Now let's just imagine that's false. Right? I'm not saying that actually is false. I'm saying let's just imagine this. Right? Let's pretend like it is. How would you then evaluate the meaning of your own life? And I think part of this is going to depend on to what degree those beliefs feature in your life. So if you've dedicated your entire life to serving God and doing the things you think God wants, right, there might be a much more serious ramification as a result of those beliefs being false than if that only made up a part, or perhaps even a small part, of your life and sort of backdrop of your projects and values and so on. Right? So this is really what Keeks is getting at. The religious answer, the moral answer, and the subjective answer approaches. None of those are really going to work. Right? They might all have good components to them, but none of them are going to work. So what you need is really this pluralistic approach, one that allows for a wide variety of different ways in which lives can have meaning, but that also allows for the fact that not all lives will necessarily have meaning. Right? Lives can fail to have meaning, and lives can fail to have meaning despite the fact that the people living them might judge that their lives are meaningful. All right, so lives might not have meaning, and people can be wrong about whether or not their lives have meaning. Keeks ultimately thinks both of these things are true, and that's why he gives the list of conditions near the end of piece. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up here for today. Tomorrow we're going to take a look at Susan Wolf's article, where she also talks about the meaning of life and the need for some kind of objective condition. So this meeting of subjective involvement and engagement with certain objective conditions. Though unlike Keeks, we're going to see that Wolf thinks it really is some sort of moral component that matters. As we're going to see, projects of worth, she says in her phrase, but we're not getting into that right now, so we'll leave that for tomorrow. Hope you're having a great day, and you'll see me when I'm back talking about Wolf on Thursday. Bye for now.